Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
So we're starting off today looking at some really interesting research.
Yeah.
And it was actually included in the session readings for the virtual summer school in entrepreneurship research this year, 2025.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of cool to think about that, this is now the 5th year of this no-fee summer school, and it started back in 2021.
It's amazing that they've kept it going.
I know. It's a huge commitment.
It is a huge commitment, and I think it speaks volumes about making research accessible.
Absolutely.
And we should definitely give a shout out to Professor Vishal Gupta and PhD candidate Athena Skiadopoulou.
Yes.
Both from the University of Alabama for spearheading this.
They've done fantastic work.
They have.
I mean, just to make this kind of knowledge freely available, it's incredible.
So the specific paper that we're diving into today is titled Gender Characterizations in Entrepreneurship, a multi-level investigation of sex role stereotypes about high-growth, commercial, and social entrepreneurs.
And it was written by Vishalki Gupta, Alice M. Wieland, and Daniel B. Turbin.
Right.
And published in the Journal of Small Business Management back in 2019.
Interesting.
We've talked about gender stereotypes before on the show. But what I really liked about this paper is that it really does give us this immediate understanding why certain assumptions about entrepreneurs stick around.
Right.
Especially when we start to think about the different types of ventures out there.
That's a good point because, we often just lump all entrepreneurs together.
Yeah.
But there are so many different types of businesses and goals.
Exactly. And this research...
Motivations.
Yes, motivations, absolutely. And this research really digs into those subtle ways that our perceptions about gender can actually shift depending on what kind of business we're talking about.
Right.
Are we talking about like a high growth startup or maybe a company that is really focused on just remaining stable in a local market?
Yeah, that's a very different picture.
Or a company that's, entirely focused on profit versus one that's really trying to have more of a social impact?
Huge difference.
So today our goal is to unpack those nuances for you and really look at what these underlying biases might mean for anyone who's involved in or observing the entrepreneurial world.
I think that's really valuable because we all have these unconscious biases.
Yes.
And understanding them can help us make better decisions.
Absolutely.
Whether we're entrepreneurs ourselves or investors or just members of the community.
All right, so let's jump in with something that I think probably rings true for a lot of us.
Okay.
And it's this general idea that entrepreneurship is often seen as a very male-typed area.
Oh, absolutely.
That's a classic stereotype.
It's like there's this almost default image in our minds of an entrepreneur.
Like a Silicon Valley bro.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and so much of it leans on traditionally masculine traits.
It's that whole image of the risk taker, the go-getter.
Yes.
The one who's not afraid to break the rules.
Right, and that's definitely been the dominant narrative.
And it's not just a superficial stereotype.
Right.
The paper really highlights how this has become this gospel image. And it's something that I think a lot of people operate under, whether or not they're even conscious of it.
It's insidious, it's so deeply ingrained in our culture.
And I think that this has implications for everyone.
Absolutely.
Not just women.
Yeah, men feel the pressure too.
Right. They feel this pressure to embody this very, very narrow definition of what it means to be an entrepreneur. And for women, it can unfairly limit their opportunities.
People might not even realize they're doing it, but they might be less likely to invest in a woman's business or mentor her.
Or even just take her seriously.
Likely.
But here's where this research takes a much more specific and I think, honestly, a more interesting turn.
Okay, I'm curious.
While we understand that broadly, entrepreneurship has this sort of masculine tilt. The researchers noticed that no one's really drilled down on how this stereotype might change when you start to consider different kinds of entrepreneurial activities. It's not enough to just say entrepreneur equals male.
Right. It's too simplistic.
And call it a day.
Yeah.
We really need to look deeper.
Absolutely.
And they made a really strong case in this paper for looking at these different categories of entrepreneurs to get a much clearer and more nuanced picture of how these stereotypes actually function.
So they're not treating entrepreneurship as this monolithic thing. They're recognizing the diversity within it.
Exactly.
I like that.
And I think that that's one of the things that makes this paper so valuable.
Yeah.
To understand the roots of these stereotypes The paper draws on something called social role theory.
Okay.
And I think that maybe some of our listeners might have heard of that before.
Probably.
But can you give us a quick overview of what social role theory is all about?
Sure. So social role theory is basically this idea that our beliefs about different groups, like in this case, men and women, come from observing them in the typical roles they tend to occupy in society. So over time, these repeated observations lead to generalized stereotypes.
Makes sense?
Like, for example, if we constantly see women in caregiving roles, we might start to associate them with communal traits like being nurturing and warm.
Yeah.
And if we see men predominantly in leadership or business roles, we might associate them with agentic traits like being assertive and independent.
Right. So it's almost like these roles become these expectations for how people should behave.
And it's not even necessarily conscious.
Right.
It's just these subtle associations that build up over time.
And the theory is suggesting that these associations get sort of broadened
Right.
and applied to the whole group.
The whole gender.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which leads to these widely shared stereotypes.
Exactly.
And it's not necessarily about inherent differences
No.
between men and women.
It's more about the roles that society has traditionally assigned to them and the characteristics we've come to associate with those roles.
So building on that,
Okay.
the study focuses on two key distinctions within the world of entrepreneurship. One is whether a venture is aiming for high growth versus low growth.
Okay.
And the second is whether it's primarily commercial versus social.
Gotcha.
So let's break those down a little bit so that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, good idea.
When we say high growth, we're talking about those ventures that are, designed to scale rapidly.
The ones that want to take over the world.
Exactly. Like they're aiming for significant expansion.
Yeah.
And they really want to have a huge market impact.
You might have heard them called gazelles.
Yes.
In the past.
Right. Like that's an older term
Yeah.
for these types of businesses. And then on the other end, you have low growth ventures.
The slow and steady ones or
Yeah.
the ones that are happy staying small?
Sometimes they're called mice.
Oh, right.
And those are the companies that are either growing very slowly or maybe not even growing at all.
The mom and pop shops.
Yeah, exactly. They could be lifestyle businesses.
Yeah.
Companies that are just focused on serving a very specific local market
Right.
without any major expansion plans.
They're just happy doing their thing.
Okay. And then how do they define commercial versus social?
So commercial ventures are all about the money.
Yeah.
Their primary goal is to maximize profit.
The bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. The bottom line is king.
Got it.
Social ventures, on the other hand, are more mission-driven.
Okay.
They prioritize creating social value.
So they're still businesses.
They still need to be financially sustainable.
Right. But their core mission is different.
Yeah, it's about addressing a social problem or making a positive impact on the world.
And they're very clear in the paper that these aren't like...
Rigid categories.
Right.
Yeah.
They acknowledge that it's more of a spectrum.
Like a continuum.
Right.
But using these ideal types, as they call them,
Yeah.
it helps to highlight the key differences for their analysis.
So it's like taking these theoretical benchmarks to help us better understand this really complex reality.
Exactly.
By looking at these distinct types, they can then investigate how gender stereotypes might attach themselves differently.
Right, because the stereotypes might play out differently
Right.
depending on the type of venture,
Okay, so this leads us to the really core of the study.
the juicy stuff.
Yes, the juicy stuff. There's specific predictions
Okay.
or hypotheses
Hypotheses.
and what they actually discovered.
Let's hear it.
So let's start by looking at that high growth versus low growth distinction.
All right.
What do they expect to find there?
Well, I'm guessing they expected to find that high growth is associated with masculinity.
You would be correct.
Okay.
Their first hypothesis, which they label H1A in the paper,
Yeah.
proposed that high growth entrepreneurs would be perceived as more similar to men, meaning they would be associated with more masculine characteristics.
And were they right?
They were.
Okay.
Their research supported this prediction.
So the data actually showed a link between masculine traits and high growth entrepreneurs.
There was a clear link in people's minds between traits that are typically ascribed to men and the traits that they associated with entrepreneurs running these high growth businesses.
Which kind of makes sense given our earlier discussion about that stereotypical image.
Right. It really aligns with that established idea of an entrepreneur as this driven, assertive figure.
Right. One who's always hustling and pushing forward.
And unfortunately, these qualities are still often stereotypically linked to masculinity.
Yeah, it's a problem.
So if you're a woman who's aiming for rapid growth, you might be bumping up against this unconscious association that people have in their minds.
People might not even be aware they're doing it,
Right.
but they might unconsciously favor a man over a woman.
And then their second hypothesis,
Okay.
H1B predicted that low-growth entrepreneurs would be seen as more similar to women.
So the opposite. Low growth equals feminine traits. So associated with more feminine characteristics.
And did that one hold up?
And again, the findings back this up.
Interesting.
There was a significant correlation between the traits that people associate with women
Okay.
and the traits that they associate with entrepreneurs who are running these slower growing businesses.
So it's almost like high growth is not only valued more in a business sense,
Right.
but it's also gendered as male.
It is.
While low growth, which might be seen as less ambitious, is linked to feminine stereotypes.
Yeah, and I think that this could have implications for how these different types of ventures are valued and supported out in the world.
Yeah, like investors might be less likely to fund
Right.
a low growth business.
Or mentors might not see the same potential.
Exactly, and that's a problem.
Yeah, because low growth businesses can be just as important
They can be.
to the economy and to society.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the commercial versus social entrepreneurs.
Okay.
What were the researchers' expectations there? Well, I'm guessing they expected commercial entrepreneurs to be seen as more masculine.
You are correct.
Okay.
Their next hypothesis, H2A, suggested that commercial entrepreneurs, with their primary focus on making a profit, would be seen as more similar to men.
Yeah, that aligns with traditional views of business.
Right, and again, this lines up with those traditional views of business and those agentic competitive traits that are often associated with men.
The whole Wall Street image.
Yeah.
Right.
And once again, the data supported this.
So the stereotype holds true,
It does.
even in this specific context.
The image of a profit-driven entrepreneur often involves, aggressive negotiation,
Yeah.
laser focus on the bottom line.
And those traits are still often stereotypically linked to masculinity.
And so if you don't fit that mold,
Right.
it could really impact how you're perceived in the commercial space.
People might not trust you
Right.
to make tough decisions.
Or they might not think that you're capable of being as ruthless as you need to be
Exactly.
to succeed.
And for social entrepreneurs, I'm curious about that.
Their hypothesis, H2B, offered a little bit more of a complex picture.
Okay.
They predicted that social entrepreneurs would be seen as similar to both women and men.
Interesting.
The reasoning here was that while that social aspect might bring in some of those feminine associations of care and community, the entrepreneur part would still carry some of those masculine connotations of drive and initiative.
So it's like a mix of both.
It is.
Masculine and feminine.
And the findings supported this as well.
Wow. So social entrepreneurs really are breaking the mold
They are.
in terms of gender stereotypes.
It seems to be blurring those traditional gender lines.
Yeah. It's not fitting neatly into either box,
It's not.
which is great.
But I think that's a really positive sign.
It suggests a more multifaceted perception of what it means to be an entrepreneur.
Right.
It's not just about profits or growth.
It's also about making a difference in the world.
Exactly.
The study also looked more directly at these concepts of agency and communality. And as a quick reminder for us, what exactly do those terms mean in the context of this research?
So agency refers to traits like competence, independence, assertiveness, characteristics that are often associated with achieving goals and getting ahead.
Okay.
And then communality, on the other hand, encompasses traits like nurturance, warmth, a concern for the well-being of others, traits that foster connection and social harmony.
So how did those two dimensions play out when people thought about the different types of entrepreneurs?
Well, I'm guessing high-growth entrepreneurs were seen as high in agency.
Yes.
Okay.
Hypothesis 3A predicted that high-growth entrepreneurs would be seen as higher in agency than in communality.
And that was supported.
It was.
Okay.
Which again reinforces that idea that those fast-growing ventures are linked to those sort of go-getter traits.
Right, like they're all about action and achievement.
Right.
Not so much about nurturing relationships.
And conversely, their hypothesis 3B proposed that low-growth entrepreneurs would be seen as higher in communality than agency.
And was that supported too?
And that was also supported,
Interesting.
aligning them with those more nurturing, relationship-oriented characteristics.
So it's almost like the language we use to describe businesses
Yes.
carries these gendered associations.
It does.
High growth versus low growth.
Yeah.
It's subtle, but it's there.
And the pattern continued when they looked at commercial versus social ventures.
Okay.
Hypothesis 4A suggested that commercial entrepreneurs would be perceived as higher in agency than communality.
Which makes sense,
Yeah.
given their focus on profits.
And again, which was supported.
Okay.
And then for social entrepreneurs,
What about them?
Hypothesis 4B predicted that social entrepreneurs would be seen as possessing both agentic and communal characteristics.
A balance of both.
Yes.
And was that supported?
And the research did support this.
Interesting.
Although it's important to note that they were still perceived as slightly higher on agency than on communality.
So even though they're focused on social good,
Yes.
there's still that expectation of competence and drive.
Yeah, so while there's recognition of those caring, community-focused traits, the entrepreneur label still seems to pull towards that expectation of competence and drive.
It makes you wonder if that could be a barrier
It does,
for some social entrepreneurs.
especially those who might lead with more of a communal approach.
Exactly. Like, if you're not seen as assertive enough,
Right.
people might not take you seriously.
So the researchers also wanted to see if there were any differences in how men and women perceive entrepreneurs.
Okay, that's a good question.
And their fifth hypothesis, H5, proposed that men would tend to see entrepreneurs in general, as well as those in high growth and commercial ventures, specifically as predominantly masculine,
Sure.
while women would have a broader view and see them as possessing both masculine and feminine traits.
So men have a more stereotypical view,
Yes,
and women are more open to seeing a range of traits.
right. And the findings provided partial support for this idea.
Partial support.
Yes.
So what does that mean?
It means that as they predicted, women did perceive more overlap between the feminine stereotype and entrepreneurs in general,
Okay.
as well as those in high growth and commercial sectors. But, and this is a crucial part, both genders still strongly associated those types of entrepreneurs with masculinity.
So even though women were a bit more inclusive,
Yes,
the overall picture is still pretty masculine,
it is,
regardless of gender.
which is interesting.
It is.
And I think also a little disheartening.
Yeah, it suggests that that male-typed image is deeply entrenched
It is.
in our society.
However, the fact that women did perceive even a slightly greater degree of overlap with femininity could still be significant.
How so?
The authors suggest that having more women in decision-making roles
Okay.
within the entrepreneurial ecosystem,
Like in venture capital firms?
yes, in venture capital firms on advisory boards, could be beneficial because they have this slightly broader understanding of what a successful entrepreneur can look like.
They might be more open to funding women or people who don't fit the stereotype.
Right. They might be more receptive to individuals who don't perfectly fit that traditional masculine stereotype.
That's a good point.
And that could lead to more diverse
Yeah,
and ultimately more successful ventures being supported.
it all comes back to diversity.
It does.
Having different perspectives at the table.
Yes. And I think this research really underscores the importance of diversity at all levels of the entrepreneurial landscape.
Absolutely.
Okay, so finally, the study delved into the role of something called modern sexism.
Modern sexism. Oh, okay.
And this is a term that I think comes up quite a bit.
Yeah, I've heard it before.
But can you remind us what it means and how it connects to their findings?
So modern sexism is basically a more subtle form of sexism.
Okay.
It's not as overt as traditional sexism. It often involves denying that gender inequality still exists
Okay.
or being resentful towards efforts to address it.
So how did this more subtle form of bias play out in their research?
Well, their final hypothesis, H6, predicted that people with higher levels of modern sexism would be less likely to see an overlap between the entrepreneurial role and feminine stereotype. And their findings supported this.
Really?
Yeah, especially when it came to perceptions of entrepreneurs in general and also for social entrepreneurs.
So even these more subtle, perhaps unconscious beliefs about gender equality
Yeah.
can influence how we view who can be a successful entrepreneur.
It's really insidious.
It is.
Because it's often operating below the surface.
Right, and it's particularly interesting, I think, that this was found
Yeah.
in relation to social entrepreneurs.
Yeah, that's surprising.
It suggests that even in a field that's often associated with, more communal values and helping others,
Right.
these subtle biases can still be present.
So what can we do about it?
Well, the researchers actually suggested that interventions, like training programs,
Okay.
that are specifically aimed at reducing modern sexism could be helpful in broadening those societal perceptions of who can thrive as an entrepreneur.
That makes sense.
So just making people more aware of these biases
Right.
can actually have a positive impact.
Awareness is the first step.
It's
and
it.
then we can start to challenge those biases.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to note that the researchers used a very robust methodology
Okay.
to investigate these questions.
Tell me more about that.
They actually conducted 2 separate studies.
2 studies.
Yes, one that was looking at group level perceptions
Okay.
and another that was looking at individual level associations.
So they were really thorough.
They were trying to capture these stereotypes from different angles.
And did they use any specific tools to measure these things?
They did. They used something called the Shine Descriptive Index,
Okay.
and its enhanced version.
And what are those?
They're essentially these standardized lists of descriptive words and phrases. And participants are asked to rate how characteristic these terms are of different groups.
Okay.
So in this case, men, women, and various types of entrepreneurs.
So they're looking for patterns
They are looking for patterns in how people describe these different groups.
and how much overlap there is.
Exactly. And by comparing those patterns, they can then assess the degree of overlap in how those groups are perceived.
That's clever.
And to recruit their participants, they used Amazon MTurk.
MTurk.
Yes, which is an online platform where you can recruit people to participate in research studies.
Okay.
And they noted that this helps to ensure a geographically distributed sample.
So they're not just getting people from one area,
Well,
which is important.
it is because you want to make sure that your findings are generalizable to a wider population.
Right. You don't want your results to be skewed
Right.
by a particular group of people.
And the fact that the results were consistent across both of their studies, even with slightly different variations in the measurement tool,
Okay.
further strengthens our confidence in their conclusions.
So it sounds like they did a really solid job
They did.
with this research.
Okay, so pulling all of this together, what are some of the key practical implications that our listeners should take away from this research?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that there are still significant challenges for women entrepreneurs,
Yes.
especially in high growth ventures.
That strong, almost default association of high growth entrepreneurship with masculine traits can really create significant obstacles.
Yeah, in areas like funding networking,
Right.
even just general perception.
Yeah, but there was that slightly more encouraging finding about social entrepreneurship
Right.
being perceived in a more gender-neutral way.
Yes, that was a bit of a bright spot.
It was.
It suggests that social entrepreneurship might offer a more level playing field
Right.
when it comes to gender.
But even in this space, the study hinted that aspiring social entrepreneurs might still benefit from demonstrating those agentic qualities.
So even though it's about social good,
Yes.
you still need to be seen as competent and driven.
Yeah, it seems like those traits are still seen as really important for success.
Yeah. It's a tough balance
It is.
because you don't want to lose sight of your social mission,
Right.
but you also need to be able to get things done.
And the researchers did acknowledge some limitations in their study.
Oh, okay. Like what?
Well, for instance, they focused on these very specific ideal types of entrepreneurs.
Right.
And they point out that other important distinctions, like whether a venture is driven by opportunity versus necessity, or whether it's in a low-tech versus high-tech sector, also warrant further investigation.
So there's still more research to be done.
There is
Yes.
in this area.
And as with any research that relies on surveys,
Yeah.
there's always the potential for participants to present themselves in a certain way.
Right. They might not be completely honest.
Yeah, even if it's unconscious.
Or they might try to give the answers they think the researchers want to hear.
Exactly. So they suggested that future research could use more implicit measures,
Implicit measures.
like implicit association tests,
Okay.
to tap into those stereotypes.
So getting at those unconscious biases.
That's interesting.
And they also noted that this study was conducted in the United States. So it would be valuable to see how these perceptions might differ across cultures.
Yeah, different cultures might have very different views
They might.
on gender and entrepreneurship.
So to summarize for you, our listener,
Okay.
it seems that our perceptions of entrepreneurs are indeed deeply shaped by gender stereotypes.
Yeah.
But this varies considerably depending on the type of business we're talking about.
Right.
High growth and commercial entrepreneurship are still very strongly linked to those masculine traits
Yeah.
and that idea of agency, while low growth ventures tend to be associated with more feminine traits and communality.
Okay.
Social entrepreneurship presents a more complex and somewhat more gender neutral picture.
Yeah.
Although even there, those agentic qualities are still highly valued.
It's a complex issue.
It is.
With a lot of nuances.
And interestingly, women tend to have a slightly broader view of who can be a successful entrepreneur than men do, while those who hold more modern sexist beliefs are less likely to see those feminine traits as compatible with entrepreneurship.
That's a key finding.
It is.
Yeah.
It really highlights the subtle but powerful ways that these underlying biases can shape the entrepreneurial landscape.
Yeah.
Often in ways that we don't even realize.
And it makes you think about how those biases might be affecting your own decisions.
It does.
As an entrepreneur, as an investor.
As a consumer.
As a consumer.
So it gives you a lot to think about.
It does.
And it makes you wonder how these often unconscious beliefs might be influencing our own perceptions of the entrepreneurs we see in the news, the types of businesses that get funded, and even the career paths that people might consider.
Yeah, it's all connected.
And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener.
Okay, I'm listening.
Given how deeply ingrained these gendered perceptions of different types of entrepreneurs seem to be, what could the entrepreneurial world look like if we actively worked to challenge and dismantle these biases?
That's a great question.
What might a truly gender-neutral vision of entrepreneurship across all sectors and growth ambitions actually unlock in terms of innovation, economic growth, and social progress?
That's something to really ponder.
It is. It's definitely something to ponder.
Thanks for bringing this research to our attention.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.